Good afternoon. My name is Sherwood Smith. I want to welcome you to the first of our Finding Answers Together, Exploring, Explaining, and Educating Around Racism. I want to acknowledge our sponsor, the Vice President's Office for Diversity, Engagement, and Professional Development, and our host, the Center for Cultural Pluralism. I also wish to acknowledge that the University of Vermont occupies the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki people, and that it is important for us to acknowledge that history and to support and acknowledge the Abenaki people in the present. Next, I would like us to have an opportunity to meet the panel for today. As I said, my name is Sherwood Smith. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Director for the Center for Cultural Pluralism and Senior Executive Director for Diversity Engagement. Next, Krista, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Krista Hagen-Howe. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm the diversity educator for the Center for Cultural Pluralism.
Paul.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul, he, him, his pronouns. I serve as Senior Advisor for Strategic Diversity, Equity, and Engagement in the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Thank you, Paul. Next, I'd like to look at some of the logistics. So everyone should know that mute is the default. So everyone is muted, but you will have access to a events live Q&A where you can place questions or comments, and we will be checking those and we will try to answer those as time permits in the second half of the session. This session is being recorded and will be posted after the recording once we've had a chance to check and make sure all of the captioning is correct. There is a live captioning option. I recommend that everyone click on that, please. Next, I would like to do a brief overview of the session. So the session will run from 12 to 1. The first 30 minutes will be a presentation by our panelists. We want to try to cover exploring the 4 levels of racism, explaining systemic racism. We then also wish to spend some time describing systemic racism, and following this, there will be a period of question and answers going into those questions which you have typed in for us. I want to acknowledge that this is a large topic and we probably will not get to all of those questions. We will attempt to answer them later and post those answers on the website. I also want to acknowledge that we may not address questions which aren't the focus of the session. At this point, I would like to take an opportunity to just go over some basic group agreements. We'd like you to stay engaged, and we are endeavoring to make this as engaging and as productive of your time as possible. We acknowledge that each of you should speak your own truth. We ask you to lean in if topics seem to raise some discomfort for you. That discomfort is often challenge and discomfort are a part of learning. Please accept that because of the complexity and size of this topic, that you shouldn't be expecting closure, that this is an ongoing process and we hope we are adding to your ability to engage in it more effectively. And we ask that you own your own beliefs. And by that, I mean that I would say I think and I believe rather than generalizing for whole groups or for people I'm not representing. So I'm taking the first piece, and this is, what is race? So race is real in the sense that it impacts our lives daily. It was created as a division of human beings based on observable differences and assumptions about ancestry. The problem with race and what makes race inaccurate is that there is actually more genetic variation within a group. For example, Swedes would have more genetic similarities to possibly someone from Somalia or Ethiopia than they might within the Norwegian region. So a Swede and a Norwegian might be less similar than a Swede and an Ethiopian. The other piece is that race was really a construct by Europeans, and it reflects and enacts systems of privilege, which privileged the perceptions of European ancestry and whiteness. This can be seen in some of the original work around race. One of the definitions I like is by a person named Stephen Jay Gould, and Gould points out that in his view, race is a false classification. The problem is that it's one we've all been taught from early on, and so just because it's false doesn't mean we don't still operate using it consciously or unconsciously. One of the earliest creators of race categories was a guy named Blumenbach. And if you look at this definition I've posted, you'll see that when we refer to whites as Caucasians, Blumenbach actually believed that the Caucasus Mountains were the origin of human beings, and that this was the ancestral home from which all people spread, because he thought that the most beautiful group of men, not people, he says men, sexism's at play here, were the Georgians. And so from its early origins, it placed Europeans and particular types of Europeans as superior to others, and this has continued to play out for us. The next piece will sort of look at how this plays out as we look at racism itself.
Hi, everyone. So I want to take a moment to really look at racism. And again, we're going to be doing this pretty quickly so that we can really dive into systemic racism. And I want to open by saying that if you've joined this space with the understanding or assumption that racism is largely rooted in overt examples like the KKK or racial slurs and more, you're not alone. And in a few slides, we're going to expand on what racism really is and start getting at the many complexities and intersections of racism. And I also think it's important to acknowledge that all of us here, this presenter absolutely included, engage in racist systems and racism. I think it's important to acknowledge how pervasive it is so we can be able to really see it and not just see caricatures of racism. So what definition are we going to use? I have one that I'd like to propose, and it's on the next slide right here. So this definition is from a favorite textbook of mine, of Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, the 3rd edition. And this definition is, we define racism as a pervasive system of advantage and disadvantage based on the socially constructed category of race. Racism is enacted on multiple levels simultaneously. Institutional structures, policies, and practices interlock with cultural assumptions about what is right and proper to justify racism. Individuals internalize and enact these assumptions through individual behavior and institutional participation. Woven together, these interactions create and sustain systemic benefits for whites as a group and structure discrimination, oppression, depossession, and exclusion for people from targeted racial groups. And what I really appreciate about this definition is really looking at the multiple levels of racism, which I'll be getting into in just a moment. And something else I think about when I'm thinking about racism in general is really thinking that it's the combination and the addition of racial discrimination and systemic power. So what do I mean when I say multiple and different levels? Let's take a quick look at a little diagram on the next page. I want to chat through this image here. And what you'll see in front of you are 4 circles, right, all laid on top of each other. The outer one being light green and saying cultural. And so messages that are cultural or societal are messages that we're receiving through art, media, societal norms, cultural assumptions that reinforce this idea that the white racial group is better than or superior to other racial groups. And it's important to note that the messages are not always so clearly stating that, right? Sometimes it's just by saying that the way folks speak or dress or the food that they eat becomes that norm, and then that becomes what's accepted. The next level I want to address is systemic. So also called structural racism, but think of that as laws, policies, and systems that all work together to hold and offer opportunities and advantages to white people and disadvantages to folks of color. The next circle, so you'll kind of see it's where it begins to get dark, is interpersonal, dark in color on the screen, I mean, but interpersonal, where individuals are holding prejudices or biases and intentionally or unintentionally acting on racist ideas or assumptions. And lastly, I want to acknowledge the level of internalized racism. So recognizing that folks from all racial groups receive and internalize messages about the groups that they belong to and other groups. So on the next slide, I just have a quick overview of what I've just talked about, just in case anyone wants to take a quick screenshot. You can also email me and I'm happy to send these to you. But what I really want folks to take away from here is to understand that we went through this really quickly. This is something I could spend weeks, really talking and crafting understanding around. But what we want to do here is create a general understanding so that you understand the many structures and the many levels of racism, so that my colleague Paul can really dive into systemic racism.
We're going to pivot here to talk about systemic racism. And what I would ask that all of you do is to please do your best to just hold the definitions of both race and racism that my colleagues Sherwood and Krista have provided for you. The reason being is that we've intentionally designed this session to just build off of these different definitions and these different concepts, so that as we go into this kind of really major portion of our session around systemic racism, you have a much better understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to try to provide you a very, very broad overview of what is known as systemic racism. As Krista and Sherwood have alluded to, this is really, again, a cursory kind of look at it, but we really do hope that it provides you a conceptual framework to understand when somebody mentions systemic racism in the media, or if you have read about it recently in a book or something along those lines, that you really, again, are going to be able to walk away from this session truly understanding that. And something that I think is also really important to note in this whole conversation is also a word that you've probably heard a few thousand times, especially over the past few weeks. And that word is equity, and kind of what that means in the context of, again, a system of racism, at least, again, within our American context. So when we talk a little bit about equity in the context of systemic racism, I wanted to share with you just a small part of the definition of equity. And what that means is that when we talk about equity in this context, we're really talking about eliminating the racial predictability and disproportionality of which people in the US have access to things like affordable healthcare, a high quality education, and sustainable wealth, and many, many other things as well. But again, when we're talking about equity in the context of systemic racism, this is what we are trying to work towards. And the reason is this. About 2 years ago, the National Geographic publication published a whole issue on the topic of race. And really, again, not only commemorating Dr. King's assassination, which happened 50 years ago, but also to really reconcile its own part in systemic racism as an institution. So they published this infographic that just highlights the ways that race can impact people in our country from birth to death. And again, in this whole infographic, which we've also linked in the announcements in case you'd like to take a closer look at it yourself, it really just showcases the different ways and the different impacts that race has on, again, the predictability and the disproportionality that certain people in the United States, again, can, do these different types of things. And if we take a kind of a zoomed in look at just a couple of examples within this infographic, you'll be able to see a little bit of what we're talking about. And I'm just going to highlight 2 examples from this infographic for you to get, again, a better sense of what it is that we're talking about. So if you look at your screens on the left side, you'll see that according, again, to 2016 statistics, and actually, again, if you look up more contemporary statistics, either 2019 or 2018 data, you'll actually see that sadly, some things have gotten even worse. But let's just, again, take the 2016 data with those in our country, at least, living without insurance. And we see that according to this data set, Hispanics and Blacks, 16% and 11% respectively, did not have insurance here in our country. And one of the reasons that this is so important to note is, especially now as we're living through the COVID-19 pandemic, is we're looking at the disproportionate impact of things like living without insurance have on one's ability to access affordable healthcare and to get, again, the treatment that they might need. The second example that we wanted to just highlight for you is the uneven rate of unemployment amongst different races here in the United States. So in 2016, about 8% of Blacks were, again, unemployed, Hispanics 6%, white and Asians 4%. What's really fascinating about this one data point is that the unemployment rate of Blacks in our country has been approximately twice that of their white counterparts for over 60 years. Through all of the economic ups and downs that we've experienced as a society, that number has remained really, again, consistent in that regard. And in fact, if you look at the data from 2019, that has actually even increased. And I am sure once we see the data come out of this whole pandemic that we're experiencing, that we're going to see, again, if not that same exact pattern, an even more kind of exacerbated difference between the unemployment rate of certain groups of people. And so we mention all of that because we wanted to give you a sense of, again, what systemic racism might look like in terms of its outcomes. And in this next diagram that we're going to show you, we wanted to also just provide you a very simplified conceptual visual of what systemic racism actually can look like in our country. And I want to add the caveat that this really is just a snapshot of our much larger system that's playing out in our country right now. So if we take a look, what you'll start to see on your screen are a number of different institutions that make up a part of our society. Institutions like government, our education system, and that includes, of course, our pre-K-12 system, our higher education system, etc. You'll also see that there are a number of other institutions that make up, again, a piece of our system. What's really interesting, I think, about all of these institutions is that they don't operate independent of one another. They operate together in, again, what is known as a system. And so as you start to see the lines connecting different institutions, we hope that you'll start to see and think about the different ways that, for example, how our education system is impacted and influenced by our government, how our criminal justice system might be connected to our education system, how businesses play a role in education, etc. You can see and you can connect many different institutions together and start to see how, with all of these connections that are made, that you start to, again, see the interplay between them. You can't have an institution operating independent of other institutions within a system. In many ways, again, they are all interconnected. And so this diagram, again, this very simplified snapshot of a piece of our system, we hope, will start to get you to think about what we're talking about as we talk about systemic racism. So just to make sure that I land on a few points, just as Krista did a few minutes ago, with systemic or structural racism, it's again, this interlocking set of parts that together make a whole. As Krista was alluding to, as we talked a little bit about racism as well, our system is an established way of doing something, such that things get done right consistently, and they're just assumed to be the normal way to do things. I'm sure many of you have probably heard the phrase before, but this is always the way that we've done things, or something to that effect. But what is often, again, invisible and just assumed is exactly right what the system is designed to do, is to make everybody feel like what is happening is normal. And the last piece that we wanted to just emphasize with this is that in a system of systemic racism in this regard, it's a system that runs by itself. It doesn't necessarily require planning or initiative by a single individual or a group in order to perpetuate, but what it does require, right, again, is all of these different things working together. And we would add that frankly, it doesn't hurt to have people planning or taking up initiatives to help this kind of move forward. All right. So the next section that we're going to do is try to walk you through just a few examples to really highlight what systemic racism has looked like in our country.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm going to focus on two topics. I provided this slide, has a lot of information. I'm not going to read it. I want to just talk about these two examples briefly. The first and second are important because they were involving educational institutions, both K-12 in the case of eugenics and higher ed, and especially higher ed in case of the Tuskegee experiment. So in the first case, eugenics was a national policy. There's an excellent book called Breeding Better Vermonters, as state fairs and activities were used to try to select the best children. Eugenics believed that there was a way in which people could be selected for their best qualities. Tuskegee experiment was a case of research. In this case, between 1932 and 1972, African American sharecroppers were convinced that they were being given treatments for syphilis when they were not. Over 300 of them were allowed to continue without treatment, even though penicillin had been discovered. This was funded, initially was funded research. When the funding stopped, the research got independent funding. So Paul's model of how was this supported by institutions. It's a bit ironic that the reason these people were sharecroppers were because they had been former slaves and were not able to get land of their own and were forced to work on someone else's land. And this was carried out because people were complacent, and the assumption was that this was good, objective research, when researchers' own bias in selecting the population they were going to use in not treating them was supported by a larger social structure that said, in some ways, this is okay, this is normal. So there was a predictable negative outcome, and it was consistent over an unbelievably long stretch of time. Eugenics is another case in which the idea that we could breed out social problems, we could breed out criminality, caught on in the US in the 1920s. It was moved forward, and people thought that they could legitimately sterilize. Huge numbers of people across the US were sterilized without permission, based on the assumption that they did not deserve to have children because they had genetic defects. They were feeble-minded, they were imbeciles, they were, in Vermont, they were considered, ne'er-do-wells, right? And this was supported by Ivy League institutions, by the social work industry. People were institutionalized and were not allowed to get out of the institutions unless they agreed to sterilization. So you can see from Paul's model how these systems interacted to support these two, in my view, horrendous horrendous treatments of our fellow human beings. Now, in the modern day, we can look at the SAT tests. And any of your folks who have graduated high school, I'm still remember taking the pre-SATs and the SATs. These tests were claimed to be scientifically objective, and yet all the research has continued to show that they differentially treat African Americans. They also differentially treat people based on income. And as Paul pointed out, if African Americans have historically made less money because they've had less educational opportunities and less job opportunities as a result of discrimination, you can see how those two factors jointly cause these tests to differentially impact African Americans. But the test itself has shown that the way it is structured, that the test itself is biased in terms of the outcomes. If you look at this next slide, you'll see that over a 17-year period, the test was unable to significantly change the gap in the way the scores were differentiated between whites and blacks. Again, predictability and a disproportional impact are markers of systemic racism. There's a lot more information on these, and I'm happy to talk more, but these are two examples. And because I'm a former zoology undergrad and because I teach in higher ed, they're ones that continue to be important. Krista's going to do hiring practices.
All right. So when I was thinking about examples of systemic racism, one of the examples I really wanted to talk about and get at was hiring practices and this idea of organizational or workplace culture fit. And so I want to open by referencing a study that was done and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was published in 2017. And to really get at that, what was found in this study is that white applicants received 36% more callbacks than black applicants and 24% more than Latinx applicants. And so just to break down a little bit what happened in this study, it was done over 25 years. And there were 24 different field experiments where there were over 54,000 applicants applying for over 25,000 positions. And in terms of the work that went into this, there were really carefully crafted resumes that were audited and checked for similar and identical experiences, and folks that got in-person interviews were coached and really trained on how to show up. And so the reason why I open up with this study and this information is to really show that hiring discrimination against Black Americans has not changed in 25 years. So thinking about that statement, what does that say? What that says is there is an indication that biases that folks are holding, which again is an example of interpersonal racism that we talked about just a few minutes ago, are still coming into play while folks are making hiring decisions, reviewing applicants, talking about positions. And that's just an example of how deeply embedded these levels of racism are and how many of them connect back to systemic racism. And I also want to think about conversations that happen around fit. I don't know about you all, but I have heard many conversations from folks that are hiring or just chatting about the hiring process where they talk about this idea of whether or not someone fits in the organization. Whether an applicant fits their style or their culture or not. And I want to just pause on that for a moment to really think about what we're saying and what we mean when we say fit, and also to think about who gets to decide who fits and who doesn't. And I think a lot about when folks are making decisions and sometimes having to confront this idea of finding folks that think similarly to you, or finding folks that look like you, or finding folks that have shared experience, and that being a strength. And I think that is something that absolutely kind of supports and holds up systemic racism. Sometimes, I know when I'm talking to folks about systemic racism, there's almost this like, oh, well, gosh, there's nothing I can do if it's systemic and it's not about me. But that's bogus, because I mean, really, we're all so deeply connected. And I want to give an example of one small way we can kind of push back against systemic racism within this one example of hiring. So, I think about the folks who are recruiting for positions and hiring for positions, right? And then I think about the social networks and the professional networks that they have, and then the identities of folks that might be within those networks. Thinking about that being one small way that folks can really confront some of those limitations and interpersonal biases and individual biases, and really have it come out at a systemic level. And I think too, when we're having these conversations, I think a lot about something that I've heard, our Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion say, of course, that being Wanda Heading Grant, that systemic racism wasn't created in an hour, and so it can't possibly be dismantled in an hour. And so it's so important that we understand that in terms of whether it's attending this training here or an affirmative recruitment training, understanding that those are all really critical aspects and critical pieces of our education and our work. And it really takes ongoing conversations, ongoing awareness, and education to really continue to address and confront this. And my hope for you all that by having some examples in this, as we're kind of talking through, and I know Paul will have another example shortly, is that you're also able to see how this fits into your understanding of systemic racism, and really come up with your own examples as you kind of sit back and reflect on a lot of what we've learned today.
Thank you so much, Krista, for that really great example. I think that it's really good to hear and to talk through, again, just different ways in which systemic racism shows up in the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. We wanted to share with you one more example of, again, just how in housing practices and policies, systemic racism has played out. And so let's kind of travel back in time together a little bit to right after World War II in the year 1945. A new arm, if you will, of our government called the Federal Housing Administration comes to fruition. And it's specifically designed to not just help veterans and the families of veterans that are coming back from war, but other Americans as well, in order to finance homes. And of note, this is really important that prior to, again, about the 1940s and up until the 1930s, one had to have typically an enormous amount of capital in order to purchase a home, sometimes as much as 50 or even, again, almost 100% of that payment for that home. But all of the financing schemes that organizations like the FHA have helped to create are things that we still have now, things like the 30-year fixed rate mortgage and others. It was an incredibly huge opportunity for many people all across the country to, for the first time, start to, again, buy and own their own homes. It's also when we saw the development of suburbs all across our country and of other, again, neighborhoods like that. But one of the things that we started to see in the documents that the FHA started to produce around their policies underwriting certain mortgages was that they warned certain realtors and other people who were trying to access these loans that the quote unquote presence of even one or two non-white families in a particular neighborhood could undermine real estate values. And so we saw restrictive covenants right here in Vermont and all over the country that started to really limit the groups of people that were able to move into certain neighborhoods. And the practice that we now know of as redlining is when, again, those types of practices started to become institutionalized in our housing policies. And again, redlining is literally where the FHA and others started to color in certain neighborhoods within certain towns or cities or states to show that those were where largely, again, Black, Hispanic, and other, again, folks of color were concentrated. Over time, what this did, and again, what we're talking about over time is from about 1945 onwards, is that we saw through just the FHA and through our federal government's policies regarding housing, a subsidization of the accumulation of wealth in largely white families, and a huge divestment of wealth in BIPOC communities. And again, this was happening in every single state, in every single territory, all across our country. And if we fast forward the clock a little bit, we take a look at this kind of simple table from the Brookings Institute, and we look at the median net worth of households, and we take a look at the differences between the wealth of white families and of Black families by income. We see a huge disparity. And if you look all the way at the top 10%, you can see, again, just this enormous disparity between the wealth of white families in the top 10% and the wealth of Black families, even those Black families that occupy the top 10% of our country as well. But we have to ask ourselves, how then did we get here? In 2016, where this data is from, how did we see this enormous, again, wealth gap occur? So according to Brookings, white families receive much larger inheritances, on average than Black families. And a couple of economists have concluded that those inheritances and other intergenerational transfers account for the racial wealth gap more than any other demographic and socioeconomic indicator in our country. And over the next couple of decades, we are going to witness the greatest transfer of wealth that has ever existed in really the history of our species. Approximately $30 trillion is going to be transferred from one generation, the baby boomer generation, to younger generations. And again, not all of that is attributable to the housing policies of the 1940s, but a lot of it is. And so if we look at the roots of, again, this unprecedented transfer of wealth and the huge disparities in wealth between particularly white and Black families in our country, we can see the roots of that right in our housing policies. And so we hope that these examples, the one that I just shared about housing, the ones that Krista and Sherwood also shared, provide you some concrete examples of how systemic racism can play out in our system and have played out in our system. So we also wanted to spend just a few minutes here. We want to make sure that we get to your questions, but we wanted to just quickly summarize the few things that we've tried to cover here in a short amount of time. The first one was simply, right, as Sherwood described earlier, that race was a socially constructed classification of human beings for a very specific purpose of, again, placing one group of people above another. Krista described that racism is this pervasive system of advantage and disadvantage based on race. We talked a little bit about the 4 levels of racism, from the cultural to the systemic to the institutional and interpersonal, and then of course the internalized as well. And last but not least, we spent a little bit of time talking about systemic racism as, again, this interlocking set of parts. And I just want to encourage you to think about that diagram in your head, just to kind of really highlight how all of these different pieces, these different institutions within our system work together to reinforce one another. So what we'd like to do now is to start to switch over into our question and answer portion of the session. And what we have done is we have a couple of great moderators in the background here working to designate different questions to different panelists here. So you'll see one of us coming up here in just a moment. So I think Sherwood, yep.
Hi. So I see that there are two questions I'm going to try to cover. One is on, do I believe in reverse racism? And how do different levels of racism show up at UVM? So the challenge I have around reverse racism is that it implies that there is systemic oppression by a dominant group by a non-dominant group. So in order for there to be reverse racism, for example, I'll use myself as an African American. African Americans would have to have systemic control over the police, the legal system, representations in government. In order for racism to work, there has to be institutional power. So I don't see a way that it's easy unless you had a time machine and you could go back and restructure history for reverse racism to work. Separately, I think the term prejudice can be applied. At an individual level, I could be prejudiced against someone else. I could be prejudiced against white people, but that does not have the same institutional support in the way an ism does. I think racial sensitivity has been used in some ways. There's a wonderful book called White Fragility. I think sometimes people use racial sensitivity to suggest that people of color are too sensitive around racial topics. I also think it's sometimes used to imply that whites don't have a right to talk about race because we as people of color are so sensitive about the topic. And I think it's critically important that whites talk about race. I think all too often Anglos, Caucasians, whites don't talk about what race means for them. I think the conversation is important about what racism means for us, but I think whites sometimes are blind to the fact that they're part of a racial category and what are the stereotypes and generalizations that they hold as well. I hope that's a brief, good answer for those first two questions.
Hey all, so I would like to address a question that came in around how do different levels of racism show up at UVM? And I'll give a couple examples, acknowledging too that a couple of things. One, that we're an institution that has been around for over 200 years, and there are definitely a lot of opportunities, again, to kind of go back to when I was referencing what Wanda Head and Grant said around systemic racism really being something that has had centuries to develop. And so we really need to be actively taking it apart. But some of the examples that I think about when I think about some of the levels of racism, I think for one, for those of you that are familiar with the institution's history around Cakewalk in terms of it both being an event, but then also the way that it was supported by the university and talked about in terms of one example. I also think about examples around the identities of folks who are making decisions. I think about in terms of whose voices are amplified, whether it is institution-wide decisions, meetings via a 3-person department meeting, or a meeting with 200-300 staff members. And I think, again, I kind of mentioned around hiring, I also think about some of those as just some examples around the ways that racism can show up at different levels. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that we all are kind of showing up with our own biases. And so in terms from an interpersonal level, there's a lot of work that we all need to do. And so I'm grateful for trainings like this. And I also urge, all of you to really keep leaning in and keep learning. And I also just want to name too that, as a like a white person, I am certainly, I think it's important to acknowledge that part of my identity. I am certainly dedicated to talking about and examining racism and examining my own relationship with racist behavior, racist thoughts, racist action, and racism in general. And I am by no means the end-all expert, and will be passing along some resources towards the end, and I believe on the website, for you to continue your learning. So I look forward to answering more questions.
Thank you so much for answering those questions, Krista. And I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to all of you for engaging so much in the question and answer section. We love the things that we're seeing there, and we really appreciate, again, everything that we're getting. I wanted to take a moment to just go back to a question that was asked earlier regarding if there is a difference between racial sensitivity and racism. I just wanted to quickly address that because I think that that deserves an answer. So my short answer is no. I don't think that they are the same thing at all. I think, as Krista talked about, racism has really two very important components within racism, and that is both the racial discrimination piece and the systemic power piece that have to be present for, again, racism to be an ism, a system, again, of beliefs that are reinforcing one another. The racial sensitivity piece, I think, if I understand the question, is really just around people in our society that is being more sensitive to one another's so-called races. And I think that, again, fundamentally, those two things are quite different because one, right, the racial sensitivity piece doesn't really take into account the power aspect, whereas, again, the racism piece really needs that. The other question that was asked that we wanted to talk a little bit about was, how can we at UVM, or what, excuse me, can we at UVM do now to push our units to improve on things like more equitable hiring practices during this time, especially when our university at the moment is potentially cutting budgets and also obviously still having a hiring freeze in place, except for essential positions, specifically either COVID related or something else to that regard. So one of the first things that I would say is what we all at UVM, I think, could be doing to help our units improve on this is to make sure that, that we're already starting to think about it now, because some of us across our university have either taken our affirmative hiring training that we offer through our affirmative action equal opportunity office. Others, again, have perhaps taken it at one point many years ago, but haven't taken it recently and may not, again, be as familiar with what kind of the 2020, if you will, best practices are. But I think the more important to think about is at some point in the future, our university and other organizations are going to begin hiring again. So what are those things that we in individual units could be doing now to start getting ready for those processes? I've heard many people across the university reach out and just talk about how, for example, to expand the pools that their job searches usually get. So really brainstorming and thinking about all of the different ways in which we can expand those pools to include a lot of different people, both right here in Vermont and outside of our state as well. And I know that those may seem like really simple, kind of easy examples of what we can be doing. But it is also making sure that those in positions of power within our units, whether it's a department chair, a supervisor, a person who's delegated the responsibility of chairing a search position, those people in particular are making sure that they are trying to practice as equitable practices in that entire process as possible. Again, from the recruiting of applicants to the interviewing and vetting of applicants, and also, again, once that person is hired, helping make sure that that person kind of becomes a part of our UVM community as quickly as possible. So just a few ideas here for that question. I think we're going to pass it back over to Sherwood here.
Thank you, Paul. So the question I've been asked to address is to talk a little bit about what might be some examples of institutional racism in higher ed or UVM. The first challenges, I think, in terms of institutional racism that I think higher ed is, and UVM specifically, is trying to address is one of the examples I gave, which are SATs. The data has shown clearly that SATs are biased, the same for GREs and many of these standardized tests. And UVM is working in their admissions office to find other ways of doing a more comprehensive and complete assessment of student applications and relying less and less on these standardized tests. But in being compared to other institutions, and this is where it's systemic, one of the ways, if you look at USA Today's college ratings, is sometimes they list what school students have the best SAT scores, right? So that's a case where external forces push for the use of these tests. So that's a simple example of where I think systemic racism still exists in our institution. We're attempting to address it. I think the other piece is that there's a cultural piece of systemic racism in higher ed, and that is the tendency to assume that science is pure and objective without questioning the context of the research. And I think that that's something else we're also working to look at and to take into account more and more forms of qualitative research which better represent the people involved in the research sometimes. Back to you, Krista, I think.
All right, so the question I'd like to address is, what are some things we can do in our daily lives to help fight the systemic racism? And, I'll kind of suggest a couple ideas that come to mind for me, with the hopes that as you're thinking about your own kind of spheres of influence and experiences, maybe you'll come up with some ideas of your own as well. And I so appreciate that question. And one, I think about, meeting structure. Sometimes there are ways that meetings are run that really prioritize certain voices based on hierarchy, based on scripted decisions. And I really suggest kind of fighting against that and maybe looking at alternative ways to lead and conduct meetings that are far more inclusive, bring in far more voices, and where the power really shifts from maybe a small group of folks to the larger group. So that could be one small way. I think too about, the power of recognizing that when it comes to engaging in systemic racism, it's not just, oh, this organization is doing that, but really thinking about like the individual behaviors that we have that perpetuate systemic racism. And so, for me, as like a white person who also really enjoys hearing my own voice, I recognized the impact that I can have on a variety of my colleagues, and especially my colleagues of color, when I am taking up a lot of space and limiting their voices, their ideas, their contributions in the conversation. And so that absolutely is kind of connected to what voices are being heard, what voices are making decisions. And so for me, that has been something that I've really been looking at and thinking about too, this idea of it's not someone else engaging in racism or an if I engage in racism, it's a when. And I think that is a huge part of acknowledging that we all are engaging in so many different ways, and so really being aware of that. In terms of some other examples around ways that we can kind of push back against systemic racism is, I think, continuing education. The more that we are exposed to more voices and more understanding, and really kind of fighting this programming that we may have around not only race and racism, but I think the way we are told a lot of norms are supposed to be. So what professionalism looks like, what educated looks like, all of these things, when we are able to constantly educate ourselves and push back on those ideas, we're able to then really see opportunities and areas of change that we can influence. And so I know that that was just a couple quick ideas, and please know that I would love to have a 2-hour class just on ways to fight back on systemic racism, but I so appreciate that question.
Folks, we've got just about 6 or so minutes left before 1 o'clock, and there are just a couple of more questions that we're going to be able to get through right now. We will reiterate what we said earlier about where we're going to try to answer all of the questions that we're unable to get to right now. But for the time being, here are a couple of questions that we wanted to address because I think that they've been asked at least a couple of times. So the first one was, are the disproportionately low numbers of senior administrators of color, I am assuming not just at UVM, but in many other institutions as well, the result of systemic or institutional racism? The short answer is yes. I think that the long answer is that we take a look at at least our country's very long history of racist policies towards really any type of professional, and you take a look at how certain, again, jobs have been simply closed off to BIPOC people for generations. And so absolutely the lack of representation that we see, not just in higher education, but in Fortune 500 companies and all other types of institutions as well, is a direct result of hundreds of years of systemic racist policies that have, again, really prioritized one group of people for those types of jobs, and again, deprioritized other groups of people for those types of jobs. So that is a little bit of a longer answer, but where I'm going to leave it for the time being. The last question that we're going to get to this afternoon is, what process is UVM undergoing to work to identify and dismantle racism in our policies and practice? And I think that this is a great question to end on, because at the moment, our university has what I hope should be known as inclusive excellence at UVM. And it is a framework that the university has been trying to implement over the course of the last 4 academic years. And what it has been doing is to try to set a framework for each individual unit within our university. And by that, I mean all of our colleges, all of our administrative units, and others as well, to really help them design individualized inclusive excellence action plans so that each and every single one of those units could be furthering the university's goals of greater inclusive excellence across the university. And the really, I think, unique thing about that is that we have decentralized that process to a large degree to make sure that those individuals, again, on the ground, are working in tandem with their senior leaders, their deans, their vice presidents, their directors, et cetera, to make sure that they are making really, again, meaningful progress within their own individual units. So that's, I think, one way. That's the process that UVM at the moment is implementing in order to, again, to work and dismantle racism within our institutional policies and practice. Right now, we also have other units, though, who are taking things a step further by re-examining every single one of the policies within their, again, respective offices and really asking themselves, is this policy in any way disproportionately impacting a specific group of people within our unit? And if the answer is yes, they're then asking themselves, what do they need to do to adjust that particular policy so that that, again, result doesn't continue to occur? And so those are just a couple of different ways that the university is trying to, again, think about all of the ways it can work to identify and dismantle racism in our policies and practice. So there are, again, a lot of other great questions. I can't wait to dig into them with my colleagues to try to do our best to answer them. As we've talked about, this is just the first in a series of 3 sessions. What we're going to ask and what we're going to kind of shift to now is to really start to close out this particular session. And so what I want to kind of direct your attention to is also, again, hopefully what's on your screens. And it should look like a URL. And what we're going to just ask is if you wouldn't mind taking just a minute or so to fill out this short evaluation for us. We're just curious to see, again, how you felt the content of the session was presented, that is, and also, again, what we might be able to do better for our 2nd and 3rd sessions. The URL is just the go.uvm.edu/session Systemic Racism Eval. And again, you can access that at any time after this particular window again closes. But we hope that, again, you will do that for us. And we'll also make sure to include that in chat as well. And last but not least, as we talked about, we also wanted to make sure that you were aware that these sessions are going to continue. We can't give away exactly what session 2 and 3 are going to look like and be on right now, but we are, again, really excited about who's going to be helping with those. And we really think that these kind of bite-sized pieces are going to help further your own education and learning quite a bit as well. But next Wednesday, the 24th, and then the following Wednesday, July 1st, will be our second and then third session. Just again, a quick reiteration of the question and answer questions. We're going to try to answer them within the next 48 hours, and you'll be able to find our answers to them through the go.uvm.edu Amazing Grace URL. And this session, as you know, was recorded. And so we'll share the link with you through that website so that you can rewatch it if you want to, or you could share it with a colleague who wasn't able to make it to this session live as well. But we really wanted to, again, just make sure that you had all of the information that you might need to kind of step off from this particular session and continue your learning and journey as well. So on behalf of myself, Krista, Sherwood, we just wanted to, again, thank all of you for joining us at today's session. We hope that this has been helpful and informative for you. Again, please continue to stay engaged, as difficult as it might be as well. We hope that you also remain hopeful for the future as well. So please take care, be safe, be healthy, and we hope to see you back either next week or in another session.